when you look at organizations like a Facebook or a Twitter, are those online publications publishers or online platforms publishers? And if so, how should lawmakers kind of put them on an even playing field with traditional publications, with traditional media?
I lean toward seeing them as publishers, not simply as a platform, or some sort of just place that has no responsibility. I think that they're closer to a newspaper, a magazine, a TV station, um, because they are the way we communicate these days. Now, it's very, very, very difficult for Facebook, for example, with its billions of users, to be policing everybody on its site. And I think we've found out that's almost impossible to have happen. But I think that there should be, Facebook and Twitter will talk about their content moderation and their community rules, which that's fine. But how do you really enforce them, and what is the penalty for breaking those? But to answer your question directly, I tend to think of them, and of YouTube, and of Spotify, which is in the news right now, as more like publishers. I mean, maybe they're not the New York Times, understood, but they are. I think they need to take responsibility to at least some extent for what they are putting out into the world.
And do you think, there's been a lot of talk about reforming is it what's called Section 230 of the
Yes.
Communications Decency Act? Do you think Congress or government has a role to play there, or do you think it can be self-regulatory?
My sense, after watching it for a while, is that it cannot really be self-regulatory, because what happens with Facebook and other social media platforms is that they sort of tinker around the edges, but don't make any really substantial changes. And I do think that Congress needs to get involved with regulating the social media platforms, or publishers, if we want to call them that. And again, I say and rather than but, it has to be done in a way that acknowledges and respects freedom of expression, free speech, and all of that. So, but should these platforms or publishers have some kind of liability for what they are putting out there, or should they be held completely harmless from liability? Well, I don't think they should be held completely harmless. I think that we have to look at through the lens of free speech. I still think we have to look at possible harm done, dangerous misinformation and disinformation that hurts our society. And those are tricky. Who gets to decide that? But I think the reform of Section 230 that you're speaking of is important, because right now there's just no way to enforce any kind of accountability.
Maybe building on that, I mean, and you obviously value freedom of expression.
I do.
How do democracies deal with misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I don't think the founders of our country um, were able to think about in the way that we can think about it now, because the technology was just it is so different now. And there was no such thing as the tweet heard around the world, or anything like that. So um, you don't want to shut down everybody who has an opinion different from your own. You don't want to shut down people whose speech may even be appalling, or reprehensible. But I do think there is a point at which um, really harmful misinformation and disinformation ought to be regulated, um, not necessarily by the government, but I think by the responsible parties. And the government can sort of set the boundaries for that or help to set the boundaries for it. And then it should be enforced at a somewhat smaller um, and more detailed level. When, I mean, to be more specific, when Twitter decided to take then President Donald Trump off its platform, I mean, that was a very controversial and justifiably controversial thing to do. Um, but the decision was that, you know, Twitter basically said we are going to be responsible for what's on our platform, and we think that too much of what's being said here is deeply harmful, not just false, but actually dangerous. And so that was the move they've made, and President Trump is still not on Twitter, and that, of course, was his platform of choice. I think that there's a debate to be had there. There are certainly First Amendment scholars and lawyers who thought that that was wrong, or thought that maybe some kind of um, short-term um, penalty would have made sense, and then but he hasn't been brought back. So I there's an important debate there.
That was just what I was going to ask you about, to what extent does the Amendment apply to misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that is really it's upon us right now. You know, for example, when we look at the misinformation swirling around the COVID vaccines, okay, people can legitimately have different opinions about that, and they should be able to express them. Um, then you get to something more specific. Should Spotify continue to host a Joe Rogan who has, not in every episode, but at times, said things that have, I think, misled people at a time when it's really a matter of life and death? So I don't really want the government coming down on Joe Rogan. I mean, I think there's a free speech issue there that's very, very important. But I do think that his platform should be concerned about it, and would be concerned about it um, if circumstances were a little different. I mean, if it was just a regular person who was spreading a lot of disinformation, they might come down on that person, but there's $100 million contract here, and so there's a reluctance to do that, and I think we're seeing that too. So, you know, I spent my career in newspapers as a reporter and as an editor, as the public editor of the New York Times, and now as a columnist. I mean, I am very immersed in and very committed to First Amendment rights. And at the same time, I'm very concerned about the way social media and the platforms are being abused. So there's a real push and pull for me there.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about local newspapers, but if I may, I'd like to just a quick follow-up question on your point, particularly regarding someone like Joe Rogan. And I just kind of as devil's advocate, do you think in our society, and I know this gets down to trust, does common sense come into play where you have someone like a Joe Rogan who's a former comedian and who runs a podcast? Should people place more trust, in him more than they do a journalist in their local newspaper or a national correspondent? Should they be able to tell the difference between someone who's spouting opinion like that and someone who's delivering credible information?
Well, I would hope that they would be able to tell the difference, and I would like to think they would, but I know that 11 million people per episode are listening to a person who's almost like a cult figure. And so when he says things like, as he has said, if you're young and healthy, you do not need to get vaccinated. Well, that's not true. I mean, if you follow the science, um, and the experts, who I think are the most credible, they would find that to be a pretty dangerous thing to be spouting. So yes, it would be great if people would then do some comparing and contrasting and say, well, let me see what the CDC has to say, and what about this other doctor? And yes, he's a comedian, so let's not treat him like a medical expert. But at the same time, he's bringing people onto his podcasts and interviewing them and not challenging them or fact checking them in any way. So he's really influential. And um, that is worrisome. I think he has the right to say these things. I don't know uh, whether it's wise for a platform like Spotify to pay him unbelievable amounts of money to spread information or disinformation or misinformation that's actually could and I think, it's not unreasonable to think that some people have listened to this and said, well, I don't Joe Rogan says I don't need to get the vaccine. And that person may be interacting with people who are immunocompromised or elderly grandparents. And, that person may be fine or may not be fine. So these are really, I think there's a lot of gray area here. And I don't, I don't know all the answers. And I think we have to weigh kind of things that have conflicting values.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you. I turning to local newspapers, I know you've talked and written a lot about communities losing their local news source. And I'm curious, what would you say is the impact on those communities when this happens? And is there an example that you can point to where this has maybe been particularly hit the community hard?
Yes. Well, I wrote a book about local news, and I spent most of my career at my hometown daily, the Buffalo News, where I started off as a summer intern, and eventually took me a long time, but I did become the editor of the top editor of the paper. And so I really observed the importance of good local accountability reporting, and the importance of the way a newspaper can knit a community together, all the different roles. It's not just about watchdog journalism. So, okay, what happens when that dwindles or even goes away? And sometimes it does go away. As you know, we have news deserts now where there really are no sources of local news. And maybe there once was a weekly newspaper or even a daily, and or maybe there was a radio station. And there are places where there really is no good source of local news. So there have been studies, and I know about these because I wrote about them in my book, Ghosting the News. So some of the things that happen when local news goes away, when it withers, is people become less politically engaged. And I mean that in a positive way. They're, not that they're storming the Capitol, but that they're, for example, um, becoming committee people, or going to the school board meeting, or whatever it may be. They become less politically and civically involved in their communities, and this is documented. They become much more polarized in their voting. They go into their tribal corners much more. So rather than saying, well, my neighbor and I have a common source of facts here, which we get from our daily newspaper. And by the way, I don't think these daily newspapers need to be held up as perfect in any way, but useful, certainly. So you might have been able to say that, we both understand that there's this community issue, whatever it is, and we may disagree about how to handle it, but at least we know what the basic facts are. And this just isn't the case anymore in many places. And even in places that have, um, a daily newspaper still. And I mean, of course, I think about Buffalo because I spent, 3 decades there. One of the things that's happened with the Buffalo News, and I bet this is true in Dallas and many other places, is that newspapers that used to be able to cover the whole state or the whole, part of a state, in my case, Western New York, the western end of New York State, now they've kind of pulled in. They don't have as many people, so they can't cover the outlying areas. And so what happens often is that people just aren't really aware of what's going on with, for example, their Congress people, or the issues that are really important. Um, I mean, I will give an example from Western New York, which is that when a guy named Nate McMurray was running against Chris Collins. Now, Chris Collins was the first congressman to endorse Donald Trump's candidacy, and he was a big supporter of Donald Trump's. He was convicted of insider trading, and he went to jail. So McMurray, during all this, I don't think that Collins had gone to jail yet, but I think at this point he'd been at least indicted. McMurray went to some of the far-flung parts of Western New York where the Buffalo News no longer circulated. And he told me that he would say, I think I'm a better candidate than this person who's been indicted for insider trading. And people thought that he was lying and that he had made it up. They did not know, he told me, that, and there are news deserts in this area now, counties that don't really have news, that they just didn't know that their congressman had been indicted. And so, and when he tried to inform them, he told me that he was met by a phrase, "That's fake news." They came back at him saying that he was lying, and that wasn't true. So this is not a partisan thing. I don't care that Nate McMurray is a Democrat or that Chris Collins is a Republican. That's beside the point. But do people have the information they need? I mean, that's basically what the press is supposed to be about in the United States, to give the citizens of our country the information they need to vote and to hold their public officials accountable. But I'm worried now that that increasingly they don't have that. And it's a really big deal.
Kind of picking up on a couple things that you mentioned there, regarding credibility, trusting in the local paper, and kind of the resources to reach everyone. I know that I think you wrote recently that Americans find their local news sources more credible than their national news sources. Yeah. And yet I know the Pew Center has documented some trends about how readers don't even know that their local newspapers are in financial trouble. And I'm wondering, is there a remedy here to solve this problem?
Well, that's correct. Pew has shown, their research has shown that people, at least a couple of years ago, really had no idea. Many people had no idea that local newspapers were in trouble. I think they do more now. There's been an awful lot of, there've been documentaries, and there've been books, and there've been lots of articles. And I think they can even see in their own communities, wow, my paper is only 4 pages now. It used to be 30 pages, whatever. I think they're a little bit more aware of it now. So, but it's also difficult for people to say when they realize, for example, that their local paper may have been bought by a hedge fund. So then what I'll hear from people is, well, you tell me I should be subscribing to my local paper, but I don't really want to support this vicious hedge fund that's buying up local papers. So what am I supposed to do? And that's a tough question. And what I say is, well, if you can do it, I still think it's really important to subscribe, because you are paying for people's salaries to go to the school board meeting, to go to the council meeting, to do the investigative work. And while it might not be pure, it's about the best we have right now.
All right. I'd like to ask one last question before I turn it back to Bill to close us out. What do you think about something like nonprofit local news models that are emerging? And I think if we have the Texas Tribune here
Yes.
in the state,
Uh-huh.
is that encouraging to you? Are they sufficient? Love to
Well,
hear your thoughts.
yes, yes, they're encouraging to me. No, they're not sufficient. I mean, it's helping to fill the gap without a doubt. It's the most hopeful thing that's happening out there is that these nonprofit, they're not really newspapers, but digital sites that have reporting like the Texas Tribune, and they're all over the country now. Um, However, they have to be supported in some way too. It's often through philanthropy, which is fine. But sometimes philanthropists, have an opinion about the way things should go. I mean, the sort of the good thing about the old model, one of them was that you could really separate the advertising department from the editorial department and say, nope, we're not even going to let the advertising salespeople on the floor. And there was a real separation of church and state there. I know people now who are the editors and founders of local news websites, and they do the fundraising and they do the editorial work and they write a column, and it's just much blurrier. But on balance, I'm very happy to see them coming along these sites, and they are helping to fill in the gaps.
Thank you. Let me wrap us up with a couple of questions here. There's been some speculation that the Supreme Court might revisit the New York Times versus Sullivan case, the landmark case that kind of more or less guaranteed freedom of press in the United States. So if that happens, and we don't know what they might say, but what impact do you think that might have on freedom of the press here in the US?
The thing that it could really change is the way libel law affects public figures. So right now, let's say I'm writing an article about Joe Rogan, and I say something, I make a mistake in it, and I go to my editors and I say, I made a mistake. We need to correct it, and we do correct it. And nevertheless, this is hypothetical, I hope. Nevertheless, Joe Rogan comes, sues me, sues the paper and sues me. Well, right now, because he's a public figure, what would have to be shown is that I made that mistake with reckless disregard for the truth and something called actual malice, that I set out to say something that was wrong and not factual, and I didn't care. That is the standard that the law, the case that you mentioned, Times versus Sullivan, no relation to me, sets forth. And Justice Gorsuch and Justice Clarence Thomas have both said they think that is too friendly to the press, and they would like to see it reformed and changed, and they would like to see the press held more accountable. I hope that doesn't happen, because after many years in journalism, I know we all make mistakes and some of them are bad, but I don't know any, what I would consider legitimate journalists, local reporters, people I know in the places I've worked, who ever set out to put something false in a story. We've made a lot of mistakes. We've been involved in a lot of corrections, but we don't do it on purpose. And there's a different standard, of course, for people who aren't public figures. If you're harming someone who's a regular person, the standard is lower. It doesn't have to be actual malice or reckless disregard for the truth. This is for people who they're already in the public sphere. They're already in the public eye. They may be elected officials. They may be podcasters. So I hope that it endures, and I'm not sure that it will.
The latest Edelman Trust Barometer shows that trust in the media remains low among the public. So what thoughts do you have about ways to improve upon that disconnect between the public and journalists, and what responsibilities do journalists have to restore that trust, or attempt to restore that trust?
Sure. Yes, you're absolutely right that trust is at a low level. I've really studied this, actually. The highest level it was at was in the mid 70s, after the Pentagon Papers were published and after Watergate the Watergate scandal occurred. And it's been on a pretty steady and sharp decline ever since, and it's low now. I mean, I think that one of the things I hear about from people is they are upset about the mix of opinion and facts. They would like the news media to stick to pretty straight reporting more and not constantly have the opinion and sort of snark as they see it mixed into every single story. So I think we need to be aware of that. And part of this too is social media and the way journalists may be on TV or on social media and sort of expressing themselves and their opinions in a way that didn't used to be the case. And then, but here's my news story, and here I'm completely, please know that I'm completely down the middle or, neutral or impartial. So, I think we need to be aware of that. I would like to see us tell our story a little better and let people into how we function, be more transparent about our work. I mean, when I was the editor in Buffalo, I used to write a column. It ran most Sundays on the front of the local section, in which I took a story or a project we were working on and tried to take people behind the scenes. How did we put this together? How did we report it? What are the worries? What are the concerns? And sometimes I used it as a way to say, we got something wrong and we need to make amends. So I think if we can try to talk to people a little more effectively, that might help. But I also know that people are they've made their decisions about the media, and I think there's a lot of resentment, and I don't know that we can overcome it. It's pretty bad.
Well, let me wrap us up with this question. So what impact do you think that might have on democracies, including our own, when trust in the press is low?
Well, it's a huge problem, because what happens is people turn to other forms of information, which may be their Facebook feed, or that may be, you know, pure political opinion, or fundraising letters or whatever. I think that when our trust in facts and the truth is so eroded, there's a huge opening for autocracy to creep in. And so, anything we can do to shore up local news, to build trust, to be more transparent, and to try to get some of that common ground back, I think is extremely important right now, as much as any time in my memory. So it's a huge concern. The positive is that we're talking about it, and that I think so many people have become aware of the problems that we're discussing right now. So,
Yeah.
I have a lot of faith in Americans and in the country. So I don't think it's all dire.